The man in the corner. I noticed the man in the corner because he didn't move when everyone else did. It was a small waiting room on the second floor of an old medical building, the kind with beige walls that had yellowed unevenly over time, and chairs that had been replaced one at a time instead of all at once. Nothing about it stood out. That was the point. You sat there to forget where you were. There were 6 chairs along the wall, a water cooler that hummed too loudly, and a low table covered in magazines that were always at least a year old. A television hung in the corner, muted, playing a morning talk show with smiling faces and exaggerated gestures. And in the far left corner, where the wall met the window, there was a man standing. At first, I assumed he was just waiting the way some people do, unwilling to sit, uncomfortable, leaning back with his weight shifted slightly to one side. He wore dark clothes that didn't draw attention, a jacket too thin for the season, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He faced the corner. Not the room, not the window. The corner. I remember thinking it was strange in a passing way, like noticing someone wearing a winter coat indoors. Odd, but not alarming. My name hadn't been called yet. I sat down and opened one of the magazines, letting the low noise of the room settle around me. Minutes passed. People shifted. Someone coughed. A woman near the door stood when her name was called and left. A man across from me checked his phone, then leaned back and closed his eyes. The man in the corner didn't move. I glanced up again, this time longer. His posture hadn't changed. He wasn't leaning. He wasn't swaying. He stood perfectly still, close enough to the walls that his shoulders almost touched both sides. I told myself he was probably reading something on his phone, pressed into the corner for privacy. But his hands were empty. No phone, no bag, no paperwork. Just stillness. I felt a small itch of discomfort and looked back down at the magazine, flipping a page I didn't read. When I looked up again, the receptionist was calling another name. The man in the corner didn't react. That was when I noticed something else. No one else was looking at him, not even by accident. People glanced around the room the way people always do when they're bored, eyes drifting, unfocused, but their gazes slid past the corner as if it were empty space, like there was nothing there to catch on. I watched carefully then, waiting for someone to acknowledge him. A flicker of recognition, a shift of attention. Nothing. The itch in my chest tightened. I leaned back in my chair and studied him openly now. He was tall, taller than I'd realized at first, his head just below the ceiling tiles. His hair was dark and neatly cut, but I couldn't see his face from where I sat. Only the back of his head, the line of his neck. His shadow fell oddly, stretched along the floor at an angle that didn't quite match the overhead lights. I looked at the lights, then back at the shadow. It was too dark. Someone stood up near me, the scrape of chair legs sharp against the floor. For a brief moment, their movement blocked my view of the corner. When they stepped aside, the man was still there, but closer. Not closer to me, closer to the corner itself, pressed tighter into it as if he had shifted forward without changing position. His shoulders were almost flush with the walls now. My pulse picked up. I checked the clock on the wall. Only a few minutes had passed since I arrived. It felt longer. I told myself I was overthinking it. Waiting rooms do strange things to your sense of time. People fixate on nothing when they're anxious. Still, I watched him. I tried to notice small details to ground myself. The seam on his jacket, the slight crease at the back of his collar, the way his feet were positioned, toes pointed directly into the corner. Then I realized something that made my mouth go dry. He wasn't casting a reflection in the window. The glass was old and a little foggy. but I could see the reflection of the chairs, the television, even my own outline when I shifted. Where his reflection should have been, there was only the pale blur of the wall behind him. I blinked hard and looked again. Nothing. A laugh burst from the television, sudden and loud despite the muted sound. It made me flinch. A few people glanced up at the screen, smiling faintly. No one looked at the corner. I leaned toward the woman sitting beside me and lowered my voice. "Excuse me?" I said. "How long has that guy been standing there?" She frowned slightly. "What guy?" "The man in the corner," I said, nodding subtly so I wouldn't draw attention. She followed my gesture and looked directly at the empty space beside the window. "There's no one there," she said, after a pause. Not annoyed, just confused. My stomach dropped. I laughed weakly. "Sorry, I thought, never mind." She went back to her phone. The man in the corner didn't move. My heart was beating fast enough now that I could feel it in my throat. I told myself this was a trick of stress, of perception, that I was projecting something onto shadows and angles and silence. Then the man shifted. Not his whole body, just his head. Slowly, deliberately, he turned it a few degrees to the side. Not enough for me to see his face. Enough to let me know he was aware of me. I froze. The room felt suddenly very small, like the air had thickened. I didn't move. I didn't breathe properly. I watched the back of his head, waiting for him to turn more. He didn't. He held that position, head slightly angled, like he was listening. I became painfully aware of every sound I made, the faint rasp of my breath, the rustle of my jacket as I shifted my weight. I tried to sit perfectly still, afraid that any movement would draw him further out of the corner. The receptionist called my name. The sound cut through me like a shock. I stood up too quickly, the room tilting for a moment. When I steadied myself, my eyes went back to the corner out of reflex. The man was gone. Not stepped away. Gone. The corner was empty. Just two beige walls meeting at a seam, a narrow window letting in dull daylight. I stood there staring, my name echoing again from the desk. I walked to the receptionist on unsteady legs and checked in, answering questions automatically. My attention kept pulling backward, toward that empty corner. When I finished, I turned once more to look. The corner remained empty, but the feeling didn't leave. Even as I followed the nurse down the hallway, even as the door closed behind me, I had the overwhelming sense that I'd made a mistake, that I had acknowledged something I shouldn't have, and that it was no longer confined to the corner where I first saw it. The exam room felt too bright after the waiting area. The overhead lights were harsh and clean, reflecting off white walls and metal surfaces. The nurse spoke in a calm, practiced voice, asking routine questions while typing into a computer. I answered automatically, my mind still fixed on the empty corner upstairs. When she left and the door clicked shut, the silence settled in again. I sat on the edge of the exam table and tried to slow my breathing. The paper crinkled under my weight. I told myself that whatever I'd seen was stress, imagination, a momentary misfire of attention. Old buildings had odd angles. Waiting rooms were uncomfortable. The mind filled gaps when it didn't like uncertainty. That explanation worked until I noticed the corner of the room. It wasn't a sharp 90-degree angle like the others. It was slightly off, the walls meeting at a subtle inward slant that made the space look narrower than it should have been. I stared at it longer than I meant to, tracing the seam where the paint met. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. I looked away. The doctor arrived a few minutes later, cheerful and efficient. He asked questions, listened, nodded, reassured me. I focused on his voice, on the normalcy of the interaction. When he left, I felt steadier. By the time I walked back through the waiting room, daylight had shifted. The corner by the window was still empty. I almost felt foolish for the tension coiled in my shoulders. I went home. For the rest of the day, nothing happened. No shadows, no strange reflections. I cooked dinner, answered emails, watched a show I barely paid attention to. The memory of the man dulled slightly, like a dream fading after waking. That night, I woke up standing. I was in my bedroom, barefoot on the carpet, facing the corner near the closet. The room was dark, except for a faint spill of streetlight through the curtains. My heart was racing, my mouth dry. I didn't remember getting out of bed. I didn't remember walking. I stood there for several seconds before my mind caught up with my body. Slowly, I turned my head away from the corner and looked back at the bed. The blankets were pulled back, disturbed, as if I'd just climbed out. I forced myself to move, to step away, to turn on the lamp. The warm light filled the room, banishing the shadows. The corner looked normal again, just drywall and paint. I told myself it was sleepwalking. Stress can do that. People stand in rooms all the time without remembering how they got there. I didn't sleep much after that. Over the next few days, I became aware of corners everywhere. In my apartment, at work, in elevators and hallways and restrooms. My eyes kept drifting toward them without permission, checking angles, measuring depth. Most were unremarkable. Some felt wrong. It was never obvious, just a subtle sense that the space was deeper than it should be, that the walls leaned inward slightly, like they were listening. I avoided those places when I could. At the office, there was a storage room with a narrow corner behind a filing cabinet. I stopped going in there. In the parking garage, I parked away from the concrete columns. At home, I rearranged furniture so no corner directly faced my bed or couch. The effort was exhausting, but it helped, until it didn't. One evening, I was brushing my teeth when I felt it again, that faint awareness, like someone standing too close. I looked up into the mirror, foam still in my mouth. My reflection stared back at me. Behind it, in the corner of the bathroom, the light seemed dimmer, not darker, deeper. I spat quickly and wiped my mouth, heart pounding. The corner looked normal. I laughed under my breath, sharp and humorless, and told myself I was spiraling. Then my reflection blinked. I hadn't. It was subtle, a fraction of a second. But once I noticed it, I couldn't pretend I hadn't. I turned away from the mirror and left the bathroom light on all night. The next morning, I found scuff marks on the carpet near my bedroom corner. They were faint, like the marks left by shoes that had been dragged rather than lifted. 2 parallel lines, close together, ending right where the walls met. I stared at them for a long time before vacuuming them away. I stopped telling myself it was nothing after that. I started testing the corners instead, not touching them, not approaching them directly, just watching, noticing how long my eyes wanted to linger, how my body reacted. Some corners felt empty no matter how long I looked. Others felt occupied. The worst ones made my ears ring slightly, like pressure building during a change in altitude. If I stared too long, I felt dizzy, disconnected, like the room had slipped a few inches sideways. I learned to look away quickly. A week after the appointment, I was at work late, the office mostly empty. The lights in my section were dimmed, rows of cubicles stretching into shadow. I finished what I was doing and stood up to leave. That's when I saw him again. He was standing in the corner at the end of the aisle, where 2 partitions met near the emergency exit. Facing the corner. Same dark clothes, same stillness. My breath caught painfully in my chest. He hadn't appeared suddenly. I was sure of that. It felt like he had been there for a while, and I'd only just been allowed to notice. I didn't move, neither did he. The office was silent except for the low hum of the ventilation system. My heart thudded in my ears. I wanted to run, but the idea of crossing the open space between us felt worse than staying still. I took one slow step backward. He didn't follow. I took another. Nothing. I reached the edge of my cubicle and felt the solid divider at my back. I fumbled for my bag without looking away from him. That was when he did something new. His shoulders relaxed, just slightly, like he'd been waiting for something and I'd done it correctly. A chill slid down my spine. I backed away down the aisle, then turned and walked quickly toward the elevators. I didn't look back. In the elevator, surrounded by mirrors, I felt exposed. I kept my eyes forward until the doors closed and the space sealed itself. Only then did I let out a shaky breath. When I got home, I checked every room before locking the door behind me. Every corner was empty. But I knew better now than to think that meant anything, because I understood something I hadn't before. The man in the corner didn't appear wherever he wanted. He appeared where there was room, and every time I noticed him and looked away, I was making that room bigger. I stopped looking away after that. Not all at once. It wasn't a decision I made confidently. It was more like a rule I adopted out of exhaustion. Every time I noticed him and broke eye contact, the sense of space changed afterward. Corners felt deeper. Rooms felt slightly rearranged, like furniture had been nudged while I wasn't watching. So I tried something different. The next time I felt that pressure, the quiet pull of attention toward a corner, I let my eyes rest there. I didn't stare aggressively. I didn't challenge it. I just looked. The way you look at something ordinary. At first, nothing happened. The corner of my living room stayed empty. 2 walls, a seam, paint slightly darker near the baseboard. Then the depth shifted. It wasn't visual at first, it was spatial. The corner felt farther away than it should have been, like the room had stretched without moving anything else. My stomach tightened, the way it does when an elevator starts descending unexpectedly. I held my gaze. The sensation intensified. My ears rang softly. My vision blurred at the edges, as if the room were narrowing toward that point. And then he was there. Not stepping in, resolving. The man in the corner stood exactly where the walls met, shoulders nearly brushing both sides. Same clothes, same posture, facing inward. His presence felt heavier this time, denser, like he was more fully formed. My hands trembled, but I didn't look away. Seconds passed, long ones, nothing moved. The fear I'd expected didn't come. Instead, there was something closer to strain, like holding a difficult thought in your head without letting it slip. My eyes burned. The man shifted his weight. It was the smallest movement, but it sent a jolt through me. His stance relaxed, the tension in his shoulders easing the same way it had in the office. I understood then. He wasn't waiting for fear. He was waiting for attention. Specifically, for me to stop withdrawing it. I blinked once, hard, my eyes watering. When my vision cleared, the corner was empty again. But the room felt different, smaller. That night, I dreamed of corners without walls. Just angles in open space, folding inward endlessly. I stood at the center of them, unable to tell where one ended and another began. Somewhere behind me, something stood patiently, never touching, never moving closer, because It didn't need to. I woke with a headache that lasted all morning. After that, the sightings increased. Not dramatic, not sudden. He didn't jump out at me or appear where he couldn't be ignored. He stayed where he belonged, in corners, at the edges of rooms, in places the eye naturally slid away from. At the grocery store, I caught him between two freezer units. At the train platform, he stood where a concrete pillar met the wall. In a restaurant bathroom, I saw his outline reflected faintly in the mirror, standing just out of frame, always facing inward, always still. And every time I noticed him, the world seemed to adjust itself slightly, like a correction being made. I tried not to react. I tried not to give him anything. But I was human, and humans notice things, especially things that are wrong. The worst part was how normal everything else stayed. No one screamed. No alarms went off. Life continued. People laughed, talked, complained about weather and traffic. And through it all, the man in the corner existed quietly, unacknowledged by everyone but me. Until he wasn't. It happened on a crowded subway platform during rush hour. I was pressed between strangers, the air thick and stale, everyone watching the tunnel for the train lights. I felt the pull before I saw him. My eyes slid to the far end of the platform, to a corner where the tiled wall met a maintenance door. He was there, closer than before. Not closer to me physically, but more present. The sense of depth around him felt pronounced, like the space behind him extended farther than the wall allowed. I held his gaze, jaw tight. A woman standing next to me shifted and frowned. She glanced toward the corner, then did a double take. Her brow furrowed. She leaned slightly, trying to see around a column. My pulse spiked. She was looking at him, just briefly, just enough. Her eyes flicked away almost immediately, confusion crossing her face. She shook her head, like she'd misjudged distance or light. But she had seen him. The man's shoulders lowered a fraction. The train roared into the station, wind rushing through the platform. People surged forward. In the chaos, my view of the corner was blocked. When I looked again, he was gone. The relief was immediate and followed just as quickly by dread. That night, I realized what had been happening. The corners weren't just making room for him, they were teaching others how to see him. Every time I held my gaze, every time I refused to look away, the boundary softened. Not enough for most people to notice, just enough for mistakes, for overlaps, for accidents of attention. I had been the anchor point. I tried to stop after that. I forced myself to look away again, to deny him. But it was harder now. Once you notice something consistently, ignoring it takes effort, and effort falters when you're tired. One evening, I came home to find my apartment rearranged, not dramatically, subtly. The couch angled slightly differently, a chair closer to the wall, negative space redirected. Every change created cleaner corners, better ones. My throat tightened as I walked from room to room. Nothing was missing, nothing broken. It looked like I'd done it myself. I hadn't. That night, I sat on the floor in the center of my living room, surrounded by shadows. Every corner felt occupied, whether he was visible or not. "Why me?" I whispered. The words felt foolish the moment they left my mouth. The answer came anyway, not as a voice, as understanding. Because I noticed, because I stayed, because I looked, and because once something like him is seen long enough, it doesn't just exist in corners anymore. It starts to understand rooms. I tried to undo what I'd done. I pushed furniture back where it belonged. I filled corners with lamps, plants, shelves. anything to break the clean angles. I left lights on. I kept music playing softly so silence couldn't settle long enough to feel deliberate. It helped at first. Or maybe it just delayed things. The man didn't appear for 2 days. The pressure eased. The ringing in my ears stopped. I started to believe that attention really was the key. That if I refused to give him space, he would recede again into whatever rule he followed. Then I came home one evening and found my bedroom door closed. I never close it. I like being able to see down the hallway when I wake up. I stood there with my hand on the knob, listening. Nothing. I opened the door. The room looked normal at a glance. Bed, dresser, window, lamp. But the furniture was wrong in a way that was hard to explain. Not moved far, just enough that the corner opposite the bed was clearer, sharper, deeper. He stood there, closer than ever before. No longer pressed flat into the corner. No longer perfectly still. His shoulders were angled slightly outward now, as if he were beginning to turn. I couldn't breathe. For the first time, I felt his attention shift fully onto me. Not passive, not patient, engaged. I understood then that corners were only where he started. They were training wheels, boundaries that helped him learn shape, depth, direction. Rooms were the next step. I backed away slowly until I hit the hallway wall. My heart hammered so hard it hurt. "You can't be here," I whispered, because I didn't know what else to say. He moved, not forward. He straightened. The change was subtle, but it broke something in me. He no longer needed the corner to hold him in place. He stood on his own. The room felt smaller instantly, like the walls had drawn inward to accommodate him. I did the only thing I could think to do. I closed my eyes. The moment I did, the pressure surged, sharp, invasive, like hands on my temples forcing my awareness to fold. Panic flared. I nearly gave in. But I remembered what I'd learned. He grew when I noticed him, not when I denied him, when I measured him. So instead of looking, instead of thinking about where he was, I focused on myself, on sensation, on weight, on breath. I pressed my palms flat against the hallway wall and grounded myself in the rough texture of the paint. I counted my breaths. Slow, deliberate. The pressure wavered. I felt movement in the room behind my closed eyes. Not steps, not motion, adjustment. When I opened my eyes again, the bedroom was empty. The furniture was back where it belonged. The corner looked like a corner. I slept on the couch that night anyway. After that, I stopped fighting him directly. I didn't challenge corners. I didn't test spaces. I changed something else instead. I stopped being still. I shifted when I stood. I paced when I thought. I rearranged my life so no moment lingered long enough to settle. Not frantic movement, just constant, subtle change. Enough that nothing could fix me in place. The sightings faded. Not completely. I still see him sometimes, at the edges of places I don't linger. But now, when I feel that pull, I move. I break the geometry. I refuse to give space shape long enough to learn me. I've come to understand something important. The man in the corner doesn't hunt. He waits. He relies on stillness, on habit, on the way people let rooms become background. And most people do. Sometimes, when I'm in public, must I catch someone staring a little too long at an empty angle where walls meet. Their head tilts, their eyes narrow, and I know. They've started noticing too. I always want to warn them, to tell them not to look, not to linger, not to let the shape finish forming. But I never do, because the moment you understand what's standing there, the moment you really see it, You've already made room. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing for more long-form horror narrations. You have been listening to American Haunted Tales.
Thank you for watching.